Everyone, welcome to another edition of the Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification course. Wherever you are, please be seated. If you're joining us in the outlying areas, please be reminded of the fact that we do have the book that we're learning from tonight, the self-control unit. At the top of the Facebook page there, there's a drop-down menu on the official Peaceful Solution page, a drop-down menu showing the self-control manual. And we're going to be picking up on page 175, where the last teacher, Chris, left off. I'm glad you all made it back to another class. And we're going to be picking up, as I said, on 175. But before we do that, of course, what I would like to do is do a little bit of a review of what Chris went over in the last class. So let's go back a little ways here to page, let's go back to page 173, because he's talking about society on a global scale. And we will also go back and read the step that we're on here in just a moment. It says the last concept. Remember what we're learning in this. Let me also just remind you of what chapter we're in. We're in chapter 6, Self-Control in Society, which began on page 153. And Chris left off talking about society on a global scale, you know. And remember what a society is. It's a group of people with common values that share common ideas and goals, etc. But now also remember, there's some that are anti-establishment or anti-social. Remember the definition of anti-social, anti-society. They don't always follow the rules. They don't always have the same goals, the same morals, etc. as the rest of the people in the society. And a society is just a group of people, as I said. Could be a small community, could be a state, could be a nation, could be the whole world. We're talking now about society on a global scale or a worldwide scale. And the last concept that says that's going to be considered in this chapter is how self-control affects our society on a global scale. And the word society can refer to a small community or an entire nation. Conflicts can develop between nations just as they do between individuals. Y'all remember what a conflict is? Conflict is not a war. A conflict is simply a disagreement between two parties. You know, you could have a conflict in your own mind, you know. Do I want spaghetti tonight or do I want tomato soup? Could be as simple as that. Could be you want to watch Channel 6, your son wants to watch Channel 7. I would say be a great diplomat, turn the TV off and go take a walk, right? That would be a better solution than sit there and watch that, what we used to call the idiot box. You know, unless you're watching something that's beneficial, that's building you up, and you're not going to find too much of that on the entertainment that's offered today. So it'd be better to go out and take a nature walk. You know, go play in the dirt, get some dirt, and, you know, look under a microscope and see what's in the dirt or something, or, you know, do something that's productive. But wasting time watching television is probably the last thing you want to do. Okay, so it says disagreements also occur between opposing groups of citizens of the same nation, and that's what's called civil unrest. And we see a lot of that today in our society here in America. It says conflicts and disagreements can occur within nations or between nations for a lot of reasons. And Chris named these four here that a nation could single out a specific ethnic group within its borders and mistreat them. You know, remember what we read about in the acceptance unit about, you know, the civil what they called the civil rights movement, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, and how blacks were being treated by whites, etc. Also, remember, even you can even go back further than that. You know, how did they treat the Native Americans, you know, that were here before they landed on the shores? And it wasn't, you know, it's really funny too, because I like to remind people, you know, everybody blames what they call the white people for doing this and that. And I have to remind them, you know who the first people that landed on the shores of America was, right? That started in America. Now, America, you remember, America stretches from, all the way up in Canada, the top of Canada all the way to Argentina. Okay, that's America. So you got North America, you got North America, Central America, and South America. Okay, so let's get the America straight first. Let's get educated. The first people that landed, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he didn't come to the United States. They came down to South America, okay, and they were looking for gold and slaves. And they called them conquistadors, the conquerors that came from Spain. They were Spanish people that came and conquered the Aztecs and the Incas in Peru and in Mexico. They had a whole empire. And they came and just a few men actually, dressed all in armor. They had armor, the Indians of the land, the natives of the land, never seen any such thing. They couldn't fight against that. They just had a few spears, and they were pretty primitive when it came to weaponry. But the conquistadors had some sophisticated weaponry, and they had armor. Okay, and so just a few hundred of them were able to wipe out and take over an entire civilization of millions of people. Okay, so when I say America and the American natives, I'm talking about all the way down in, Peru, in that area, up through Central America and Mexico, before it even came here to America, or to what we call the United States of America. Okay, so now also one nation can intrude on the territory or airspace of another, which occurs quite frequently. Chris told us about how they're right now in Syria. They got oil fields set up, foreign nations are in there taking oil out of Syria without permission from the Syrian government. I would call that, what would you call that in the peaceful solution when you're taking without permission? It's called stealing, right? One nation might want the natural resources from another nation, including oil. That's a big one, but also water. A lot of nations are fighting over water. They're damming up water. I know along the Euphrates River, it's a long river and a long ancient river, there's a lot of different towns or different districts that are damming up water and trying to hoard the water and keep it from flowing down to the next, country or the next district, and they're not getting any water. Okay, and this water is necessary for them to grow their crops and to live. So there's a lot of water wars taking place as well. Nations also could disagree with each other about acquiring and using nuclear weapons. And that's, we see that going on right now with nations like Iran, who are trying to acquire nuclear weapons, and other nations are willing to do anything it takes to make sure that they don't develop them. Okay, so now let's look down at the bottom of the page. It talks about war, because I want us to get the idea of what war actually is. Because a conflict that's not resolved, it says, just like with individuals, nations or opposing forces within nations can choose to declare war. So you see that war is not a conflict. Okay, war is a disagreement, but when it escalates to the point that both sides choose to say, we can't work this out, and they escalate it to violence like this, then that's called war. War is the devastating result of a breakdown in positive communication. It's the strongest evidence that all peaceful means have been abandoned. And wars, and I really need you to underline that too, because that's our definition of war, okay? I told you quite a while back, I've read and I've seen books called The Vietnam Conflict. And it's like, well, that wasn't a conflict, Almost 60,000 people died in that conflict. That's not a conflict. That's called a war. War is where people are destroying property, they're taking lives, they've totally lost control of, and their even desire to want to work things out peacefully. So it says, war has many terrible consequences. One is the tremendous loss of life and destruction of property. War only produces love, peace, and joy. Oh, wait, I read that wrong, okay? War only produces greater resentment, hatred, retaliation, and more war. Notice what it doesn't bring. It never brings peace. War never brings peace. Even though it might, it might seem like they have peace because they won the war, so to speak. A certain nation won the war, like World War II. America won World War II. And that was thought to be the last war, but that was not the last war. We've had many wars since. Okay, so let's turn over to page 174, and that's where I want to pick up. Can you show the first slide? It says on the Chew on This, it talks about that war is a sign of failure. Hey, I thought war was great and honorable and glorious, They try to make it out like it's, heroic and it's wonderful and, it's an honorable thing to fight for your country, Well, no, the peaceful solution teaches it's an honorable thing to work things out, to always de-escalate a situation, to always try a peaceful resolution where nobody gets hurt, property doesn't get damaged, people don't get hurt mentally, physically, and otherwise, right? It says here, war is a sign of failure. It's failure to practice self-control. It's a failure to stop and think and weigh out your peaceful options of how you can resolve that matter and then proceed with the right choice to resolve the matter without anybody getting hurt. And it can be done. It's that people refuse to do it. People refuse and choose not to do it. It's failure to communicate respectfully, which we'll be reminded about here in a little while again. What we learned about in chapter 4 about communication, respectful communication. It's failure to resolve conflicts peacefully and failure to value human life, okay? And venture to say that if it was your child, if it was your property, or if it was your son or daughter, you would really think highly of it. You would be very concerned about it if it was your own. I've noticed even in my own life, sometimes it never really hit me how hurtful something was until it hit me, until it occurred to me. I remember told you I had a problem with stealing when I was growing up, and when I came home one night and all my stuff was missing out of my apartment, it finally dawned on me, hey, this isn't a great thing, man, this stealing. Somebody came in my house and took all my stuff. How dare they do something like that? Plus, I had fear in me that they might come back and do it again. I think I actually had to move after that because I was so afraid that they were going to come back and steal all my stuff again. So I finally understood, but it took somebody having to do it to me to get me to wake up to the fact that this is a very hurtful thing. It's not a great feeling, to find all your stuff missing that you, in my case, I didn't work hard for it. I think I probably stole everything I had. That's probably why I lost it all. But nonetheless, so let's go to the next slide, because I did mention that, America thought that World War II, that was World War I, it's called the Great War, it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And then, a few years later, there was World War II, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, right? And now we're talking World War III, right? I think it was Einstein or somebody, I don't know if he really said this, but they accredit it to Einstein, I don't know who heard him say it, but I think he said something about the next war. He says, I don't know who's going to fight the next war, but he says whoever wins the war, they'll be fighting with sticks and stones after that, or something like that, because there won't be anything left. You start launching those nukes, okay? These nuclear weapons are extremely hot, They call them thermo. They burn into the ground, into the soil, and they burn the earth. They explode over the city, a couple miles above the city, but it's so hot that it burns the earth beneath and everything that's below it, and everything for miles and miles around. And not only that, not only the great heat that it produces, but the fallout afterwards kills even more people than the blast itself. So they were thinking that would be the war to end all wars, but America's been involved in a lot of wars. As a matter of fact, I Googled it. How many wars have been fought in the history of the world? You know what Google said? Google doesn't know. There's no way to estimate it. Think of all the little wars that take place between, even between countries. Remember what Chris said about somebody fighting over, pastries or something. I mean, there's been. I was thinking it's probably about 1 trillion, people that have been killed in wars. Who knows? I mean, the damage that's been done, because it just seems like they're always fighting, right? Doesn't it just seem like, there are always wars going on? So I wanted to know, how many wars is America involved in right now? Because World War II was the war to end all wars, right? Well, not quite, because after that you had, I think, the Korean War, you had the Vietnam conflict, or war, it turned into a war. Let's go to the next slide. So this is what I found. It says the U.S. right now in 2022 is involved in more than 130 wars, okay, right now. And now we explain why I'm saying that. It says, depending on your definition of war. Well, I just read you our definition of war. Our definition of war is, from the Peaceful Solution, what we just read, is war is the devastating result of a breakdown in positive communication. It's the strongest evidence that all peaceful means have been abandoned. So it says, the U.S. is now involved in more than 130 wars, or none, depending on your definition of war. Or it is involved in one worldwide war against terror that successive U.S. administrations with congressional support have used to justify U.S. military operations in at least 134 countries, where they are engaged in direct combat operations, conduct special covert missions, act as military advisors, or train foreign troops or militias. So all these actions that they're taking are all part of war. When you're in someone else's country and you're training a militia to take over another nation or take over that same country you're in, training them to do, that's an act of war. Okay, so it shows that, there's many, or they're engaged in direct combat operations, or they're doing special covert operations, underhanded stuff, where they're trying to, dethrone certain individuals, certain presidents or prime ministers underhandedly. They're trying to subvert governments, okay? These are acts of war. That's not an act of peace, is it? Is it an act of peace when you go in someone's country and you set up oil rigs and start pumping oil and sending it out of their country without permission? That's an act of peace? I don't think so, right? So there's many, many, many forms of war taking place right now all over the world, and America's involved in a lot of them, and they have been for a long, long time. Now, let's go ahead and put up the next slide, because I want to introduce somebody to you. We're going to watch a video here in a moment, but I want to give this person a proper introduction. Back in 2009, we held an event in Laredo, Texas. It was a benefit for the Peaceful Solution program. It was called Plates for Peace. And we had some special guest speakers at that event. And the special guest speakers were the mother and the father of a U.S. soldier that lost his life in Afghanistan in 2003, when the war first broke out, when America declared war after 9/11. They went into Afghanistan hunting for Osama bin Laden, allegedly. And this woman that you're about to meet, her son was one of the first casualties of the war. His helicopter, his Black Hawk helicopter, went down in the desert there in Afghanistan, and he lost his life. And when I saw the movie that she was in, Fahrenheit 9/11, and I saw the grief of this mother over her child, I think every time I see it, it still makes me tear up, because I've never really understood what a mother felt for a child till I seen how this woman reacted when she found out it was her son that lost his life. And, she was a big proponent of war, growing up. She grew up in Flint, Michigan. She was a big proponent of war. She thought it was a great option. It was a great thing to go into the military and to raise your children to be patriotic and go into the military and fight for their country. So she strongly believed in it. I think most of her family served in the military at different points. But she has a very different view now. Remember what I said about when it occurs to you? What takes place? You start to see things a little differently, and you start to wake up to the reality of what's actually really taking place with war in our world. Why are we fighting wars? In fact, I read a snippet today where somebody said it's human nature to fight wars. I couldn't disagree with it. It is human nature to fight wars. If you're not taught peace, if you're not programmed with the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, and you're not taught, how to resolve conflicts in a peaceful way, you often result to war, to fighting, to arguing, to bickering. Okay, so without that education, without that positive moral education, it is in you to go to war. It is in you to fight. It is in you to retaliate and strike back. And that's why this education is necessary. As you're going to hear from her, she became a big proponent of the Peaceful Solution Program, and she's been following us now for years. So her name is Lila Lipscomb. So we're going to watch, I think it's about a 13 or 14-minute clip. So go ahead and roll the video, if you would.
Hi, everybody. I'm grateful to be part of your Peaceful Solution Character Education Fall 2018 conference. The theme being, it's time to unite. It could not be a more appropriate theme in today's world. First, I want to say thank you to William. I just have really been inspired by following the quotes that he's been putting out there. So I've been kind of following you guys through William. Since my visit in 2010, Plates for Peace, I've been, like I said, I've been keeping up with you guys through William. It's really been a journey for me to be able to heal as well as I've healed. One of the things that I love about the character education is because I really strongly believe in starting with the man in the mirror. Character education is something our world is truly missing. We all need tools to survive, and the tools shared by Peaceful Solution, I believe, are the tools to help each one of us survive. As most of you know, my son, United States Army Sergeant Michael Pedersen, was killed in the Iraq War in 2003, which would change me and my family forever. And as we also know, there were no weapons of mass destruction. And as we also know, many of us believe that it was based on greed and lies, which we know are basically the basis for most wars in today's world. My journey after my son's death to find answers was to find a place where I would be able to live with this huge hole in my heart and my soul. War is never the answer. Yes, I do believe at times we do need to defend ourselves, but that's much different than just going to war. We need to stop terrorizing people because we want what they have. In this case, as many of us believe, it was about the oil. Today, we still have Americans over there working in the oil fields. So what was the war really about? Losing Michael sent me into a pit of darkness for many years. I fought and struggled my way back to the land of the living. I had to forgive those that sent my son to his death for what I believe were the lies. I forgave so that I could finally move forward in my life, which I've been trying to do. I was tired of giving power to the greed and the lies by keeping me in the darkness and the pain. We are not responsible for the actions of others. We're only responsible for our own actions. And if we have a pure heart and are positive within ourselves, we can get through anything. And I believe this is what the character education teaches. I often ask myself, how in such a great country as America do we continue on such a path of violence and destruction? The only answers I get are because of ego and greed. So until we ourselves get a handle on our own egos and greed, this destruction is going to continue. If we as humans don't make changes within our own characters, how can we possibly change a world? Uniting together and working together is how we are all going to make it. I believe we can only work together when we respect each other. And in order to respect each other, we have to respect ourselves. After all, if we don't know who we are, how can we understand who anybody else is? One of my favorite peaceful solution quotes is, observing someone's actions reveals his or her true character. Actions speak louder than words. I believe we are all teachers, each one of us. We must live our lives as living examples. If we want a world of togetherness, respect, and love, then this is what we have to send out. Our actions cause reactions. As humans, we're the only ones that make this difficult. Another one of my favorite quotes is, in a difficult situation, remain calm. Getting upset will not help. Talk to yourself to calm yourself down and stay in control. By remaining calm, you'll be able to think clearly and rationally. I love it because it reaffirms what I already believe. I have a saying, keep your peace so you can keep your power. With all I've been through in my life, like each one of you, I have learned that when I allow people to pull me into their madness and anger, I lose myself and give them the power over me. I must keep my peace and calm at all costs. If I don't, I always find myself angry and frustrated, which isn't cool. A peaceful mind is a wise mind. I have come to the realization I do not have to accept others' frustration and anger. I can return love, respect, and peace to them. We do not have to allow others to pile their junk on top of us. We have choices. I believe we need to unite the peaceful solution character education in an endeavor to stop all wars and bring peace through education and moral character. I also believe that we need to begin teaching our youth character education earlier in life. This is a valuable tool, and reaching our children is reaching our future. What a wonderful world we'd have if everyone could understand and live in peace. We must unite. School violence needs to stop. Our children must stop being sent to wars based on greed and egos. We must each change within ourselves and save our future through uniting. I also believe that character education will stop the bullying in our world today. There's not a school in America today that doesn't have some sort of bullying going on. By teaching moral character in schools, we'll begin to teach the adults, because the kids take it home, and perhaps then one of the family members will say, I think I want some of that too. In serving in schools, we must not forget about the older generations. Yes, I know it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, but I promise you, if I can learn, anybody can learn. We must learn to keep our peace so that we can keep our power. It's time to unite. Thank you guys once again for allowing me to be a part of your conference. I continue to support you. I continue to send you love and much respect.
Okay, so as I said, Miss Lipscomb is a great proponent of the peaceful solution now, and she had to go through a lot of would you call a realistic education in what war actually is really all about. As she said, people just desire to take other people's things, or they don't have the desire to resolve the conflict in a peaceful manner. They don't want to, so they resort to just force, using weapons. In the case of America, we have a lot of weapons. We have a lot more weapons than a lot of other nations that we tend to go and invade. In that case, it was a country of. I think the opening clip was showing the war in 2003, where President Bush President Bush declared war on Iraq, it was 2001. I have to correct myself. It was 2001 when we went into Afghanistan. It was on 10/7/2001. Okay, so it'll be 21 years this October 7th. 21 years since war was declared in Afghanistan, in the war on terror. And what has it brought us? What has it got us? Taliban taking over Afghanistan again, and we left all the weaponry, all billions of dollars worth of weapons and airfields for them and everything, right? This is what the result was. The result was there was no winner. Oh, the Taliban won. They got all the weapons. And now, we got a bigger problem. In fact, just the other day, I believe one of my friends told me, he just saw on the news, I know I saw something about it, in Iraq, some people had taken over the embassy, the U.S. embassy. There's problems up there in Iraq still. There hasn't been any winner in this war. There's been a lot of losers, and Lila Lipscomb, her son, lost his life. Okay, and nobody should lose their life in war. It's not necessary. None of it's necessary. We just need to train and educate. And again, I'm not even blaming President Bush or any of the leaders that engage in war, because I know if they'd been taught the Peaceful Solution Character Education program like Lila was telling us, they wouldn't resort to these things. You can teach an old dog new tricks. You can teach people, that there's a better way, but they have to be willing to accept the information. They have to be willing and able to accept the information. They have to be willing to abide by the principles that bring peace. They have to be willing, to work it out. Is it going to go perfect at first? No. There's going to be conflicts that arise, but if we all agree on how to resolve those conflicts using the moral character education, using the positive character traits that we're taught in the Peaceful Solution, using all the tools, the tips, and the techniques that we learn, there's no problem that can't be solved. War is totally unnecessary, but it's so profitable. It's so profitable to those that wage it. There's a false concept in the world that, we got to have wars, If we don't have wars, we won't make money. Wars what keep economies going, and things. We got to have war, War is just natural. It's kind of like school bullies. It's natural, You're going to have school bullies. No, it's not. It's not natural at all. It's not necessary at all. This is a myth. This is actually a lie that's being spread, that war is, just normal, People go to war occasionally. People bully each other. Well, they only bully each other because they haven't been taught not to bully. And sometimes, even when they're taught, they still want to bully. People have to make the choice. They have to make their own choices. All right, so let me go back to, let's go back to page, lesson plan 6, page E. And let's look at the step we're on now. It says, explain to students, I'm in step 8, explain to students that the final area they will cover is self-control within and between nations. Tell students that nations can also have conflicts. When the leaders of nations fail to control how they interact, the result can be war, which affects the whole world. So notice, when we have war, it doesn't just affect us, okay? It affects the whole world. This war on terror, it affects the whole world. And that war on terror is not over. They're still waging it, okay? Have students turn to page 173 and 174, which we did, and read the sections entitled Society on a Global Scale. Emphasize that nations can only trust each other when they interact with self-control and respect. Now, notice it does not mention 175 and 176, but you just know that since the next step starts on 177, you should include 175 and 176 in this particular step. So let's go back to page 175. That's where Chris actually left off for me. And at the top it says straight talk. It says self-control between nations means to keep negotiating until a peaceful solution is found. A diplomat must be willing to correct the wrong decisions of his nation, and he would if he learned what is taught in the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. Now, that sounds like a pretty big boast, doesn't it? Sounds like I'm trying to sell a program, like I'm trying to sell you. Well, I am. I am a salesman. I'm not making any money from it, but I'm trying to sell you on the idea that if you use the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, you will see a change very quickly, not only in your own life, but in those that you influence through teaching them. Even by your example, as Lila said, she said, we're all teachers, we're all teaching all the time. She works in a job center, she's not a quote unquote educator teacher, but she has children and she teaches her children through her actions. She's aware of that. We teach everyone, we teach everyone in our environment by our actions. We either set the right example or we set the wrong example. All right, but we're all teaching, at all times. And if everyone learned what is taught in the Peaceful Solution, if diplomats were willing to correct the wrongs that have been done through the education in the Peaceful Solution, we could see peace break out on the earth. If we were willing to correct the things we've done wrong, go back and correct them. If you want to get to the root of the problem, you just got to trace it back. You got to trace it back. Well, where did this start? You got to trace it back. And I remember the author of the Peaceful Solution, he took out a full-page ad in USA Today back in 2001 after the 9/11 event, and he said, let's not do this. This is a bad idea. Do not go to war. War is not the answer. Let's sit down together and let's get down to why is this taking place? What's the problem between the parties here? Let's find out where did this start, and let's be willing to fix it. Let's be willing to communicate and respect one another, respect one another enough to listen to one another, and let's try to fix this problem. Okay, now let's look at the word diplomacy. I want to put up the slide. This word diplomacy, it means the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, typically by a country's representative abroad. Now, do you have to be a diplomat assigned by a country to engage in diplomacy? Or to be a diplomat? No. Okay, it just simply means the skill of managing interactions with people. Okay, the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations. Do you realize with what you know right now, what you've already learned in the Peaceful Solution Program, you are miles, not to brag or anything, but it's the truth. You're miles ahead of the greatest diplomats. Remember Chris was saying that, the diplomats, we went, and I'll show you here in a minute, I'll show you some pictures, but in these embassies, there's some really great ambassadors, that have some really great skill on how to deal with people. And they can make you feel really great about things. But you know what they don't have? They don't have the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. Now, they know bits and pieces, and they know how to communicate respectfully in a lot of cases, and they know how to win people. I guess they probably read the book called How to Win Friends and Influence People or whatever, or The Power of Positive Thinking, or, something to help them along. They probably took some psychology classes, but they don't have the moral education. They don't have the moral education, and that's the most important thing, because without that, okay, you don't even really understand what stealing is. You don't even really understand the first thing about, what starts wars, not asking permission, not seeking permission, not, asking before touching or borrowing somebody's items, etc. I mean, you don't even know the basics of why you're even at war with somebody if you don't know the Peaceful Solution. But some of the synonyms of diplomacy are tact, tactfulness, sensitivity, discretion, finesse, delicacy, judiciousness, discernment, cleverness, skill, politeness, thoughtfulness, understanding, care, soft skills, and there's a French word, savoir-faire. I've heard that before. It's, I guess, some kind of, diplomacy thing there. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. And a diplomat is an official representing a country abroad. A diplomat representing a country abroad. Now, in the peaceful solution, we have many, many diplomats. Now they don't have, they haven't been sworn in as diplomats by the United States government or any government, but they engage in diplomacy with other nations, and they try to show them, we try to show them the way that they can both have peace with one another. Okay? And as I said, the peaceful solution is the greatest teaching tool on the face of the earth to bring peace in an individual's life, in a community, a state, a nation, and in the world. If it's practiced, if two parties both agree to practice the peaceful solution together, to learn it and to practice it, you can actually have peace. The author of the Peaceful Solution, Yisrael Hawkins, boasted you could have peace in 30 days. Peace in 30 days in any nation on earth if they actually would start practicing the peaceful solution, teaching it, getting it into the schools, teaching all their diplomats, teaching all their government officials and the teachers in the schools. You can do it rather rapidly. Okay? And we can show you how. All you got to do is ask. But a diplomat is just an official representing a country abroad. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide, because I want to show you a picture. I will call this shuttle diplomacy. Okay? Because the word shuttle means a form of transportation that travels regularly between two places. And I'm sure you've heard of shuttle diplomacy, where certain ambassadors, they're always flying back and forth between two locations, trying to work out peaceful resolutions with different countries. Well, we have what's called shuttle diplomacy in the peaceful solution, where we have, as you can see here, this was back in 2012, 2013, when we had the Stop All Wars campaign going. Okay, it was the Stop All Wars campaign, where we were showing people in Mexico, in Washington, D.C. We were going to all the embassies in Washington. Chris told you in the last class, we were visiting all the embassies, telling them about the peaceful solution and how they themselves could first start in their own country to bring peace to their own country. And there were many that were interested in that idea. Okay? Now, in the Stop All Wars campaign, we had 3 steps to stopping all wars. Okay, 3 simple steps that you could take. Step 1 was to slow down and assess what's going on. Okay, in other words, stop and think, okay, what's taking place? What's causing the problem? What's the root of the problem? Where did this start? So slow down and assess what's going on. Step 2, admit we need to change and we have to be quick about it. There's no reason for it to drag on. We can stop the war immediately. All we need to do is get to the bottom. Okay, assess the problem. What's going on? Let's stop the hostilities. Okay, and let's sit down and let's talk about it and let's get to the root of the problem. Let's discuss it. Let's communicate. Let's be respectful with each other. And step 3, we have to lay a foundation for every child in the world by making available the best character education program ever. Yes, that's a true fact. It's a true fact that the peaceful solution is the best. You know why? You know why the peaceful solution is the best character education program? Because I know personally, I've tried other things. I can tell you right now, I've tried, before I ran across the peaceful solution, I tried a lot of different things. I tried a lot of different programs. A lot. Okay? I read books, self-help books. I tried everything. I mean, literally, from religion to different types of philosophies and all kinds of different ideas that people had where I could start thinking differently or whatever else. And you know what? Some of it benefited me a little bit, but it was only when I learned the peaceful solution, I never saw a prison again. And I mean, I didn't go back to prison for doing something, for stealing from somebody or doing what I used to do. But I started going back to prison to visit people and teach them the peaceful solution, right? So, and then I started educating even probation officers and correctional officers and the very people that used to be my enemies or my captors, you know. I would sit down with them and I would talk to them about the peaceful solution. And you know what? I never had one of them disagree. I never had one of them disagree with what the peaceful solution taught. How can you disagree with the things that you've been learning in this program? How can you? You know, they're simple. A lot of people say it's just common sense. You know, when they read it, it's common sense. But you know what? It's not common because it's not being taught everywhere. So in the Stop All Wars campaign, if you can put that picture back up, you know, the picture at the bottom there, yeah, as you can see, we have a whole team. That top picture there, that's Peaceful Solution headquarters. There was many buses that headed down. In this case, we were going to Mexico, as you can see in the bottom picture. We went into the most dangerous city in Mexico at the time, Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, right there on the border with Laredo. And you know, there was a lot of talk about. I think even we went with President Obama's brother Malik Obama, who was also another proponent of the peaceful solution, and we were warned not to come by the government. The government said, "You're taking your life in your own hands," and even President Obama warned Malik, his brother, "Don't go there." But you know what? One thing I've always noticed about the peaceful solution, when you come and you're trying to spread peace, you know, it just seems like things work out okay, you know. We didn't have one incident the whole time we were there. We were there all day and we traveled all throughout the city and we met with even stadiums full of people. Heard the peaceful solution, okay? And we never had any problem with anybody there. Now the mayor there in the white shirt, Benjamin Galvan, Mayor Benjamin Galvan, he actually lost his life. He's the one I told you about, the mayor that the cartels killed a few years back. And we were very sorry about that because he was a huge proponent of the peaceful solution. He did a lot for the peaceful solution program in Mexico. And he got a lot of teachers taught, and he got it implemented in his city, in his schools. He allowed us to teach all the teachers, to train them, and they were given the Spanish Peaceful Solution Building Moral Excellence program, and they started teaching it in their schools. I haven't checked lately to see how they're doing, but we might have to check with them, right? Okay, so then the next picture, that same trip, we went to Washington. We also went to Washington, D.C. That's Embassy Row. Embassy Row is huge. There's embassies for 193 countries in Washington, D.C. So this is just a small fraction of the pictures you'll see of some of the embassies. But it's a very beautiful place to visit. But we walked all up and down Embassy Row. We met with even if we knocked on their doors, sometimes we didn't get in, but we left them something from the peaceful solution, okay? And we left them something that some books, and we left them materials that they could go over and learn about the peaceful solution program. Now, I got to tell you this. Remember where it said at the top here, a diplomat must be willing to correct the wrong decisions of his nation? And he would if he learned and he was taught in the Peaceful Solution program on page 175 there. Go to the next slide because I want to show you. You realize that diplomats in the countries under the Vienna Conventions from 1961, diplomats have immunity from prosecution for criminal. They can murder someone and not go to jail. They can rape someone, they can commit crimes, and they cannot put them in jail. The only way they can jail them is if the other country waives the diplomatic immunity, and then they can prosecute them, but most times they won't do it. So, diplomatic immunity, let me read you this. Ambassadors and embassy personnel are normally granted diplomatic immunity. This means they cannot be arrested, sued, or taxed by the country to which they are ambassadors. That includes their families, by the way, because their families live with them when they're on these, when they're in those missions. Their embassies and communications cannot be entered or searched without their consent, because it's considered their territory. You can't even go. A U.S. police officer cannot even enter into an embassy of any nation because it's their territory. Their embassy, it says, however, a host country can expel a diplomat whose conduct it finds unacceptable, but they cannot arrest them even for murder. And in some cases, as you see in this final slide, you know, I showed you embassy row. Well, that word row also means a quarrel or a fight. And in this case, in the New York Post, it says why dirty diplomats can literally get away with murder. And some of them do. Because remember, have they been taught the Peaceful Solution Character Education program? No, they haven't. Even though they're diplomats or they're skilled in diplomacy, they are not skilled in the diplomacy found in the Peaceful Solution Character Education program, which we're going to go over here in the next class, which will be on 9/7/2022 at 5:30 p.m. Central Time, and I hope you'll join us. You've been a great audience. We'll see you next time.